They were smiling, while accusing him. Not asking questions, not checking facts, just deciding. In a school built on reputation, one black teacher became the easiest target. One quiet student became the perfect suspect. No way he did that alone. And just like that, a classroom turned into a courtroom. No evidence, no defense, just one belief. They don't belong here. But here's what they didn't see coming. The truth wasn't late. It was watching, and when it finally stepped forward, it didn't defend them. It exposed everyone. Because in that moment, the ones who thought they had power weren't judging anymore. They were the ones on trial. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe some heroes are willing to look guilty to save the innocent, this story is for you. The one who did not belong. Chicago woke under a low gray sky, the kind of cold morning that made the windows of Westbridge High School look pale and lifeless. Wind pushed fallen leaves across the front steps as students hurried inside, laughing, talking, and shaking the cold from their coats. By the time the first bell rang, room 214 was already restless. Then Malcolm Brooks walked in. Malcolm Brooks was a 36-year-old African-American physics teacher with deep brown skin, a calm face, and eyes that always seemed to notice more than he said. He was tall, but not intimidating. Lean, but strong in the quiet way of someone who had learned not to waste energy proving himself to people who had already judged him. His hair was cut short and neat, with a faint line of gray near his temples that made him look older than he was. He wore a dark navy sweater over a white collared shirt, simple black slacks, and a worn leather watch his father had given him years ago. He did not walk like a man trying to impress anyone. He walked like a man trying to survive another day with dignity. The moment he stepped behind the desk, the room changed. Not completely, not loudly, but enough. A few students stopped talking. A few exchanged glances. Someone near the back gave a quiet laugh and covered it with a cough. Malcolm placed his folder on the desk, picked up a piece of chalk and wrote 3 words on the board. Force, motion, choice. Then he turned around. Today, he said, his voice steady, we are not memorizing equations. We are going to understand why they matter. That was one of the reasons some students hated his class. Malcolm did not let them hide behind notebooks. He did not give them easy answers to copy. He asked questions. He made them explain their thinking. He made them face silence until someone was brave enough to try. And in Westbridge High, that made him dangerous. Not because he was cruel, because he expected them to think. In the third row sat Brandon Whitmore, a 17-year-old white student with neatly styled blonde hair, sharp blue eyes, and the relaxed confidence of someone who had rarely been told no. He was tall for his age, broad-shouldered, and always dressed as if the hallway were a private club that belonged to him. His father, Charles Whitmore, sat on the school advisory board, and Brandon carried that fact like an invisible crown. He did not raise his hand. He rarely did. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, tapped a pencil against the desk, and smirked at Malcolm as if the entire lesson were a performance he had not agreed to watch. Beside him sat Chase Miller, a slim white student with sandy brown hair, pale skin, and restless green eyes. Chase was not as bold as Brandon, but he laughed at the right moments and repeated the right insults when he thought it would earn approval. He came from a family that measured success by status, and he had learned early that standing near power felt safer than standing near truth. Behind them was Tyler Hayes, a heavier-built white student with a round face, short, dark hair, and a nervous habit of cracking his knuckles under the desk. Tyler was not naturally cruel, but he was afraid of being ignored. So he followed Brandon's lead, even when something inside him knew it was wrong. Malcolm drew a simple diagram on the board. A block resting on a surface, an arrow pushing forward, another resisting. Who can tell me what force is acting against the motion? Silence. A girl in the front row looked down. A boy near the window pretended to search his backpack. Brandon smiled. "Maybe the force is boredom," he said. A few students laughed. Malcolm looked at him, not angry, not surprised. "That is an emotional response," Malcolm said, "not a physical force." More laughter, sharper this time. Brandon's smile faded just enough to show he did not like being corrected. Malcolm turned back to the board. "Friction," he said. "Friction resists motion, but sometimes resistance also tells us where contact exists." Most students did not understand the deeper meaning, but Grace Mitchell did. Grace Mitchell stood in the hallway just outside room 214, holding a stack of literature essays against her chest. She was a 42-year-old white English teacher with fair skin, tired hazel eyes, and chestnut-brown hair tied in a loose bun. She was medium height, thin from years of stress more than exercise, and known among students as gentle but careful. Too careful. Years earlier, Grace had spoken up when a student was mocked for being poor. The administration told her she was creating unnecessary tension. Since then, she had learned to survive by lowering her voice, choosing her battles, and telling herself that silence was not the same as agreement. But lately, every time she passed Malcolm's classroom, that lie became harder to believe. She paused by the open door just as Brandon leaned forward. "Mr. Brooks," Brandon said, stretching the name as if it tasted wrong, "is this going to be on the test, or is this another one of your life lessons?" The class waited. Malcolm set the chalk down. "Physics is a life lesson," he said. "Every action has consequences, even the ones people pretend not to see." The room went quiet. For half a second, Brandon looked embarrassed. Then his expression hardened. Chase gave a small laugh, trying to rescue him. Tyler looked down at his desk. Grace stayed by the door, watching. She wanted to step in. She wanted to say something simple, something professional, something that would remind the students that a teacher deserved respect. But she saw Assistant Principal Linda Carver walking down the hall. Linda Carver was a 51-year-old white administrator with silver blonde hair cut into a sharp bob, narrow glasses, and a face that rarely revealed warmth. She was not openly cruel. That was what made her difficult to challenge. She spoke in polished sentences about discipline, standards, and school image. But behind those words was a habit of protecting the comfort of certain parents before the dignity of certain teachers. Grace lowered her eyes and kept walking. Inside the classroom, Malcolm began handing out a short problem sheet. "This is not graded," he said. "I want to see how you think." Brandon took the paper between two fingers and looked at it as if it were dirty. "You always make things harder than they need to be," he muttered. Malcolm heard him. Everyone heard him. But Malcolm kept passing out papers. At the back of the room sat Isaiah Reed. Isaiah was a 16-year-old African-American student with dark brown skin, a narrow face, quiet eyes, and short, tightly coiled black hair. He was thin, almost fragile-looking, but there was a stillness in him that did not match weakness. He wore a faded gray hoodie under his school jacket and kept his notebook perfectly organized, every page filled with small, precise handwriting. Isaiah rarely spoke, not because he had nothing to say, because he had learned that being noticed could be dangerous. In middle school, he had once answered every question in a math competition and beaten 3 students from wealthier families. The next week, someone wrote "cheater" on his locker. After that, Isaiah became careful. He let others talk. He let others take attention. He learned silently, quickly, deeply. Malcolm noticed him on the first week of school. He noticed the way Isaiah solved problems without showing off. He noticed how the boy's eyes moved ahead of the lesson. He noticed how Isaiah erased correct answers when someone looked over his shoulder. So Malcolm never pushed him too hard in front of the class. He only left small notes on his papers. Good thinking. Strong logic. Do not hide from your own mind. Isaiah never responded. But he kept the notes. That morning, as students worked through the problem sheet, Malcolm walked between the desks. Brandon barely wrote anything. Chase copied a diagram from Tyler. Tyler looked confused, but too proud to ask for help. Isaiah solved the first problem in less than a minute, then turned the page over and started creating a second method. Malcolm paused beside him. "Interesting approach," he said quietly. Isaiah froze. A few students looked back. Brandon noticed. His eyes moved from Malcolm to Isaiah, then narrowed. "Oh," Brandon said, loud enough for the room. "So that's how it works." Malcolm turned. "How what works?" Brandon leaned back again. "Nothing. Just saying. Some people get extra attention." The words hung in the air. Not direct enough to punish, clear enough to wound. Isaiah lowered his head. Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Every student in this room can receive help if they are willing to do the work." Brandon laughed softly. "Sure." Then, after a pause, he added the words that made the room go still. "People like you don't usually teach here." No one moved. The sentence did not shout. It did not need to. It carried years of judgment inside it. A girl in the front row stared at her paper. Chase gave a short, nervous laugh, then stopped when no one joined. Tyler's face turned red, but he said nothing. Isaiah's pencil stopped moving. Malcolm looked at Brandon. For a moment, the entire class seemed to wait for anger. They wanted it. Some of them feared it. Some of them hoped for it. Because if Malcolm got angry, they could make the story about his reaction instead of Brandon's insult. But Malcolm did not give them that. He picked up the chalk again, turned to the board, and wrote one more word beneath the lesson title: accountability. Then he faced the class. "You are right about one thing, Brandon," he said quietly. "People like me have not always been allowed to teach in rooms like this." The silence deepened. "But I am here now." Brandon's smirk weakened. "And while I am here," Malcolm continued, "this classroom will not be a place where ignorance is mistaken for courage." No one laughed this time. The bell rang minutes later, but the students did not rush out as quickly as usual. They moved carefully, as if something invisible had shifted and no one wanted to be the first to touch it. Brandon shoved his paper into his bag and walked out first, Chase and Tyler following behind him. As Brandon passed Grace Mitchell in the hallway, he smiled like nothing had happened. Grace stood still. She had heard. The silent challenge. The hallway noise faded quickly after the bell, but something from the previous class lingered. Something heavier than sound. Malcolm Brooks felt it as he erased the board slowly, the chalk leaving faint white traces that refused to disappear completely. Some words, once written, never truly left. The next class entered with less laughter than usual, not because they understood what had happened, but because they felt it. Malcolm didn't address the comment Brandon had made earlier. He didn't mention it, didn't warn, didn't punish. Instead, he continued exactly where he left off, as if nothing had changed. That was what unsettled them most. He wrote a new problem on the board, more complex, layered with multiple steps. "Today," he said calmly, "we're going to solve this without formulas first." A few students groaned quietly. Brandon Whitmore walked in late, as he often did, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression careless but calculated. He didn't apologize. He never did. He dropped into his seat, leaned back, and let his eyes drift toward Malcolm with a look that said he was waiting for a reaction, waiting for a mistake. When Malcolm didn't give him one, Brandon smiled. "Still doing it your way?" he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Malcolm didn't turn around. "Yes." Brandon let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Figures." Chase Miller chuckled beside him, quick and eager, like always. Tyler Hayes followed with a softer, uncertain laugh, glancing around as if checking whether it was safe to agree. Malcolm faced the class again. "Who wants to try the first step?" Silence. Not the kind of silence that comes from confusion. The kind that comes from refusal. Brandon tapped his pencil again, slower this time, more deliberate. "Maybe we'd answer if it made sense," he muttered. Malcolm stepped aside, gesturing toward the board. Then come show us what makes sense. The room shifted. For a moment, Brandon didn't move. Then he stood up. He walked to the front with the confidence of someone used to being watched, picked up the chalk, and stared at the problem. 10 seconds passed. Then 20. The room grew quieter. Brandon wrote something quickly, stepped back, and shrugged. There. Malcolm looked at the board. Why did you choose that approach? Brandon hesitated. Just slightly. It's obvious, he said. Malcolm nodded slowly. Explain it. Brandon didn't. He handed the chalk back and returned to his seat, his expression tight now, his confidence cracking just enough to be noticed. Malcolm erased the answer. Let's try again, he said. No one volunteered. At the back of the room, Isaiah Reed kept his eyes on his paper. His pencil moved slowly, deliberately, mapping out the problem in a way that no one else was attempting. He wasn't just solving it. He was breaking it apart, understanding each piece before moving forward. Malcolm noticed. He always noticed. But he said nothing. He didn't call Isaiah's name. He didn't force him into the spotlight. Instead, he moved closer, stopping beside Isaiah's desk as if by coincidence. Interesting, Malcolm said quietly. Isaiah froze for half a second, then continued writing. A few heads turned. Brandon noticed again. His gaze sharpened. So that's the system now, Brandon said, leaning forward. You just walk around and give hints to your favorites? A ripple moved through the room. Chase laughed louder this time. Tyler looked uncomfortable but didn't speak. Malcolm straightened. I give attention to students who are thinking, he said. Anyone here is free to do the same. Brandon tilted his head, smiling again. But it wasn't the same smile as before. There was something colder in it now. Sure, he said. Anyone. The word hung heavier than it should have. Malcolm turned back to the board and began solving the problem step by step, his voice steady, his movements precise. He didn't rush. He didn't simplify. He showed the full process, every assumption, every correction. Some students followed. Most didn't, but Isaiah did, and Malcolm knew it. After class, the hallway filled again. Lockers slammed, voices overlapped. But in the noise, smaller conversations formed. Near the drinking fountain, Brandon leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. He's doing it on purpose, he said. Chase nodded immediately. Yeah, he makes everything complicated just to look smart. Tyler hesitated. Or maybe he just... Brandon cut him off with a glance. Tyler looked down. And that kid in the back? Brandon continued. You see how he keeps going to him? Chase smirked. Yeah, guess we know who the teacher's pet is. They laughed. Not loudly, but enough. And a few students nearby heard them. None disagreed. Further down the hallway, Grace Mitchell stood by her classroom door, watching as Isaiah passed by with his head down, his hands gripping his notebook tightly. He moved quickly, like someone trying to disappear before anyone decided to stop him. Grace's chest tightened. She had seen that walk before. Years ago, a student named Daniel Park had walked the same way, quiet, careful, trying not to draw attention. He had been brilliant, but after months of subtle mockery and isolation, he transferred schools. Grace had told herself she couldn't fix everything. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore. Isaiah, she called softly. He stopped, turned. Up close, he looked younger than he did in class, more uncertain. Yes, ma'am? Grace smiled gently. How are your classes going? He nodded quickly. Fine. The answer came too fast. Grace noticed. If you ever need help with writing or anything, you can come by, she said. Isaiah hesitated, then nodded again. Thank you. He walked away. Grace watched him go. Then she looked down the hallway toward Malcolm's classroom. Inside, Malcolm sat alone at his desk, reviewing papers. He picked up Isaiah's sheet. The work was precise, clean, thoughtful. Malcolm allowed himself a small, almost invisible smile. Then he picked up Brandon's paper, half-finished, careless, confident in the wrong places. Malcolm placed both papers down and leaned back in his chair. For a brief moment, his expression changed. Not anger, not frustration. Something quieter. Weariness. He remembered another school, another classroom, another group of students who had decided what he was before he had a chance to prove anything else. Back then, the administration had called him a poor fit, too demanding, too different, too unwilling to adapt. He had adapted, just not in the way they expected. A knock on the door pulled him back. Assistant Principal Linda Carver stepped in, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "how are things going in here?" Malcolm stood. "Productive," he replied. Linda glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the board, the unfinished diagrams, the erased lines that still left shadows behind. "I've received a few comments," she said carefully. "Some students feel your teaching style is challenging." Malcolm met her gaze. "That is the goal." Linda gave a thin smile. "Of course, just remember, we aim for balance. We don't want students to feel uncomfortable." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Then, calmly, he said, "Growth is often uncomfortable." Linda's smile tightened. "Yes," she said, "but perception matters too." She turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Whitmore's father will be visiting the school later this week." The message was clear. Malcolm nodded once. Understood. When she left, the room felt colder. Outside, Brandon stood at his locker, retelling the story of the class to a small group, exaggerating details, shaping the narrative in his favor. "He tried to embarrass me," Brandon said, "in front of everyone." Chase shook his head. "That's messed up." Tyler stayed quiet. Brandon slammed his locker shut. "I'm not letting this go," he said. Across the hallway, Isaiah stood alone, listening without looking. And inside room 214, Malcolm erased the board one last time, knowing that the real problem in that room had nothing to do with physics, and it wasn't solved yet. The impossible score. The midterm exam arrived without warning. Though every student in room 214 had felt it coming, the air that morning was colder than usual, a sharp wind pressing against the windows as if the outside world itself was holding its breath. Malcolm Brooks stood at the front of the classroom, a stack of papers in his hand, his expression calm but focused. "This exam," he said, "is not about memorization, it's about understanding. Take your time." There were no multiple-choice questions, no shortcuts, just problems layered with logic, requiring students to think through every step. Brandon Whitmore glanced down at the first page and smirked, but the confidence in his posture faded slightly as he flipped to the second page, then the third. His fingers tapped faster against the desk. Beside him, Chase Miller frowned, his green eyes scanning the page with growing uncertainty. Tyler Hayes leaned forward, his shoulders tense, already lost by the second problem. At the back of the room, Isaiah Reed read each question slowly, his expression unchanged. His pencil began moving, not quickly, not nervously, but with steady precision. Malcolm walked between the rows, silent. He did not offer hints. He did not intervene. For once, the room was exactly what he had always wanted it to be. A place where thinking could not be avoided. 2 days later, the results came back. Malcolm stood at the front again, the same stack of papers in his hands, but this time, the atmosphere was different. Students leaned forward, restless, whispering, calculating where they might stand. "Grades are based on process," Malcolm said, "not just answers." Brandon sat up straighter, already expecting to hear his name near the top. Malcolm began handing out papers one by one, A few low scores, a few average, a few surprised reactions. Then the whispers started. That was hard. I guessed half of it. No way anyone got all of it. Malcolm reached the last few papers. He paused. Then he said a name. Isaiah Reed. The room didn't react at first. Isaiah walked forward, quiet as always, and took his paper without looking at Malcolm. But as he turned back toward his seat, a number became visible. Not perfect, but close enough to be impossible. The room froze. Brandon blinked. Chase leaned forward. Tyler's mouth opened slightly. Then Brandon laughed. Not loud at first, but sharp. "That's not possible," he said. The words cut through the silence. A few students looked at each other, then someone else spoke. "Wait, seriously? Did you see that?" "No way." The whispers spread faster now, moving from desk to desk, from row to row. Malcolm said nothing. Isaiah sat down. His hands tightened lightly around the paper, but his face remained still. Brandon leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Yeah," he said louder. "There's no way." Chase nodded quickly. "I mean, nobody even finished." Tyler hesitated. "Maybe he just—" Brandon cut him off. Don't be stupid." The word hung there, and then, slowly, the direction of the whispers changed. They were no longer focused on the test. They were focused on Malcolm. "I mean, he was helping him, right? I saw him walk over there. He kept stopping at his desk. It makes sense." The logic wasn't real, but it felt real enough to spread. Malcolm placed the remaining papers down. "If you have questions about your results," he said calmly, "you can come see me after class." No one moved, but no one stopped whispering either. By lunch, the story had already begun to change. At a table near the cafeteria windows, Brandon sat with Chase and Tyler, his voice low but controlled. "I'm telling you," he said, "something's off." Chase nodded. "Yeah, I mean, he barely talks, and suddenly he's the top." Tyler shifted in his seat. "But what if he just—" Brandon leaned forward. "You really think that's normal?" Tyler didn't answer. Across the room, two girls whispered over their trays. "My friend in the other class said the same teacher always favors certain students." "Yeah, I heard that too." The story grew, not from facts but from repetition. In the hallway, Grace Mitchell stood by her locker, holding a folder against her chest. She could hear fragments of conversation passing by her. "That physics class? Teacher helped him. Knew it was weird." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. She didn't stop anyone. Not yet. Further down the hall, near the computer lab, Noah Bennett sat alone at a terminal. Noah was a 17-year-old student with pale skin, messy dark hair, and sharp gray eyes that rarely missed detail. He was slightly hunched, thin, and often overlooked, not because he lacked presence, but because he avoided it. He worked part-time in the school's IT office, maintaining systems, fixing login issues, and monitoring basic data logs. He preferred machines to people. Machines followed rules. People didn't. On his screen, a log file scrolled quietly. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just routine checks. But then something caught his eye. A timestamp. He leaned closer, scrolled back, then forward again. The submission times for the physics exam looked uneven. Not incorrect, but inconsistent. Milliseconds out of place. A delay that shouldn't have been there. Noah frowned. He didn't jump to conclusions. He never did. Instead, he opened another file. Compared the logs. Ran a quick check. The numbers didn't match perfectly. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to raise a question. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. Somewhere in the building, the story was already forming. But here, in quiet lines of code, something else was beginning. Back in room 214, Malcolm sat alone again. He held Isaiah's test in his hands. Every step was clear, every answer justified, not guessed, not copied, understood. Malcolm placed the paper down carefully. Then he picked up another. Brandon's. Half complete. Errors in logic. Confidence without structure. He exhaled slowly. Outside the classroom door, voices passed by again. They cheated. I'm telling you. It's obvious. Malcolm didn't move. He had heard it before. Different place, different names, same pattern. Inside the room, the silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence as before. This one was heavier, because now it carried belief. Not truth, but belief. And belief, Malcolm knew, was harder to change. As the final bell rang, Isaiah remained seated for a moment longer than everyone else. He looked at the paper in his hands, then toward the door. He could hear them. All of them. He folded the paper once, carefully, then stood up and walked out without a word. Behind him, Malcolm watched, and for the first time he knew this was no longer just about teaching. The verdict. The next morning, Chicago felt colder than usual. Not the kind of cold that stung the skin, but the kind that settled into the bones, quiet, heavy, and difficult to shake. Inside Westbridge High, the hallways were louder than ever, but the laughter carried a different tone. It wasn't light anymore. It was sharp, knowing, and directed. By the time Malcolm Brooks reached the main office, the story had already taken shape. He didn't need to hear it again. He had lived it before. The secretary at the front desk gave him a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The principal is expecting you," she said softly, gesturing toward the closed door at the end of the hallway. Malcolm nodded once. He walked down the corridor slowly, each step measured, his posture straight. Not defensive, not aggressive, just steady. Inside the office, 3 people were waiting. Principal Harold Whitman sat behind a wide wooden desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He was a 60-year-old white man with thinning gray hair, pale skin, and a face shaped by years of authority. His voice was usually calm, but rarely warm. He believed in order, reputation, and the quiet preservation of control. To him, problems were not solved. They were managed. To his right sat Assistant Principal Linda Carver, her expression composed as always, her glasses reflecting the light from the window behind her. She held a folder in her hands but didn't open it. And standing near the bookshelf was Charles Whitmore, Brandon's father. Charles Whitmore was a tall, well-built man in his early 50s with sharp features, silver-streaked dark hair, and a presence that filled the room without needing to raise his voice. He wore a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, every detail precise. His eyes were cold, observant, and used to being listened to. He didn't sit. He didn't greet Malcolm. He simply watched him walk in. The door closed behind Malcolm with a soft click. "Mr. Brooks," Principal Whitman began, his tone formal, controlled. "Thank you for coming." Malcolm stood in front of the desk. "You asked to see me." Whitman nodded slightly. "We've received multiple concerns regarding your recent exam and grading practices." Not accusations, concerns. The word was softer, but it carried the same weight. Malcolm glanced briefly at the folder in Linda's hands, then back at Whitman. "What kind of concerns?" Charles Whitmore stepped forward before Whitman could answer. "My son," he said, his voice calm but firm, "has informed me that your conduct in the classroom has been questionable." He paused, letting the words settle. "Favoritism, unfair advantage, a lack of transparency." Malcolm met his gaze. "Has anyone reviewed the exam itself?" There was a brief silence. Whitman shifted slightly in his chair. "We're in the process of reviewing the situation." Malcolm didn't move. "So, no." Linda Carver's eyes narrowed just slightly. "This is not about technicalities," she said smoothly. "This is about perception. Several students feel that the environment in your classroom is uneven." Malcolm exhaled quietly. "Because I expect them to think?" Charles Whitmore's expression hardened. Because you are creating a situation where certain students appear to be receiving advantages others do not. Malcolm's voice remained steady. Isaiah Reed earned his score. Whitman raised a hand gently, interrupting. Mr. Brooks, this is not the time to debate individual students. That was when Malcolm understood. This wasn't an investigation, it was a conclusion. Whitman leaned forward slightly. We have to consider the reputation of the school, he said. Westbridge High is built on trust. Parents trust us to maintain fairness, consistency, and professionalism. Each word sounded reasonable. Each word avoided the truth. And right now, Whitman continued, there are questions. Questions that no one wanted answered. Malcolm stood still. And what happens when those questions are based on assumptions? He asked. No one replied. Charles Whitmore crossed his arms. In situations like this, he said, the responsible thing to do is step aside. The room grew quieter. Whitman nodded slowly, as if agreeing with something that had already been decided. We believe it would be best, he said carefully, if you took a temporary leave from teaching while we conduct a full review. Temporary, a word designed to sound fair, but it felt final. Malcolm's eyes moved from Whitman to Linda, then briefly to Charles. None of them looked uncertain. None of them looked curious. They looked resolved. Malcolm spoke again. Have any of you spoken to Isaiah Reed? Whitman hesitated. That's not necessary at this stage. Have you reviewed his work? Linda's grip tightened slightly on the folder. We are focusing on the broader concern. Malcolm let out a slow breath. Then he asked one last question. Have you considered that you might be wrong? The silence that followed was different, heavier, not because they didn't understand the question, but because they refused to consider the answer. Whitman straightened. This is not about being right or wrong, he said. This is about maintaining stability. Malcolm nodded once. There it was. Not truth. Stability. Charles Whitmore stepped back slightly, as if the matter was already finished. I trust the school will handle this appropriately, he said. Whitman gave a small, controlled nod. We will. Malcolm looked at each of them one last time. Then he said calmly, If you want the truth, you should look at the evidence. No one responded, because none of them had. Outside the office, the hallway felt louder than before, but the moment Malcolm stepped out, a few conversations stopped. A few eyes turned, then quickly looked away. Word had spread. Not just about Isaiah, about him. Further down the hall, Grace Mitchell stood near the faculty lounge, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. She had heard enough by now to understand what was happening, and for the first time, the silence she had chosen felt like something else. Not safety. Complicity. She saw Malcolm walk past. He didn't stop. He didn't look at her. But something in his expression, something controlled, contained, made her chest tighten. She opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again. Not yet. Across the building, in the computer lab, Noah Bennett sat in front of his screen, the glow reflecting in his sharp gray eyes. He hadn't spoken to anyone about what he saw. Not yet. Because he wasn't sure, but he was close. He had reopened the exam logs. This time, he wasn't just looking. He was tracing, comparing timestamps across multiple systems, tracking delays, looking for patterns. And slowly, something began to emerge. A small inconsistency. Then another. Not random. Connected. Noah leaned forward. His fingers moved faster now, opening new windows, pulling deeper data. This wasn't just a glitch. Something had interfered. Not in a way that changed answers, but in a way that changed perception. And outside, in the hallway, Brandon Whitmore stood with Chase and Tyler, watching as Malcolm disappeared around the corner. Brandon smiled. not because he had proven anything, but because he believed he had already won. The public challenge. By the following afternoon, the sky over Chicago had cleared, but the cold remained. Sunlight reflected sharply off the glass windows of Westbridge High, making everything look brighter than it felt. Inside the building, tension moved faster than any announcement. It passed through whispers, glances, and half-finished conversations that stopped the moment a teacher walked by. Malcolm Brooks stood alone in room 214, his desk cleared, his lesson plans untouched. The decision from the administration still hung in the air. Temporary leave, effective immediately. A quiet removal, disguised as procedure. He hadn't argued. He hadn't raised his voice, but he hadn't accepted it either. Instead, he had made a request. And now, that request was becoming something else. A spectacle. Earlier that morning, Malcolm had returned to the principal's office. The same room, the same three figures. But this time, the silence between them carried a different weight. "I am not asking you to trust me," Malcolm had said, standing in the same place as before. "I am asking you to test the truth." Principal Whitman had leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Brooks?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "A public exam," he said. "One student, one test, no preparation, no assistance, in front of the entire school." Linda Carver's brows had drawn together slightly. "You want to turn this into a demonstration?" "I want to remove doubt," Malcolm replied. Charles Whitmore had been the first to respond. "And if the result confirms the concerns?" he asked, his tone measured but sharp. Malcolm met his gaze. "Then you will have your answer." Whitman had studied him for a long moment. The request was risky, unpredictable, but denying it would raise more questions than allowing it. Finally, Whitman nodded. "One condition," he said. "The test will be approved by the department, and the process will be supervised." Malcolm inclined his head once. "That's all I'm asking." Now, less than 6 hours later, the news had spread through every hallway, every classroom, every corner of the school. A public test, a single student, a question of truth. In the cafeteria, Brandon Whitmore sat at the center of a crowded table, his confidence fully restored. He leaned back, one arm draped over the chair, speaking just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "This is actually perfect," he said. "Now everyone gets to see it." Chase nodded eagerly. "Yeah, no excuses this time." Tyler shifted uncomfortably. "What if he, actually does it?" Brandon laughed. "He won't," he said simply. "People like that don't just suddenly become geniuses." The sentence landed harder than he intended. But he didn't take it back. Around them, students listened. Some agreed. Some stayed silent. Across the room, Isaiah Reed sat alone again, his lunch untouched. The noise around him felt distant, like it belonged to another place. He had heard everything, every word, every doubt. He didn't look up, but his hands were tighter now, fingers pressing into the edge of the table. Not fear, not exactly. Pressure, a different kind. The kind that didn't ask if he could do it, but demanded that he prove he already had. In the faculty lounge, Grace Mitchell stood near the window, her reflection faint against the glass. The room around her was filled with quiet conversations between teachers who spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded neutral but carried clear judgment. "I don't think this is appropriate," said one voice. "It's unusual," another replied, "but maybe necessary." Grace didn't join them. Instead, she watched the courtyard below, where students had already begun gathering in small groups, discussing what was coming. A public test. A trial. She exhaled slowly, then, almost without realizing it, she made a decision. If this turned into what she feared it might, she wouldn't stay silent. Not this time. In the computer lab, Noah Bennett hadn't moved from his seat in nearly an hour. The glow of the monitor lit his pale face, his sharp gray eyes scanning lines of code with intense focus. He had gone deeper into the system than he was supposed to, not out of curiosity, but because something didn't add up. The timestamps, the delays, they weren't random. They followed a pattern. Noah ran another comparison, cross-referencing the exam submission logs with the server response times. His fingers moved quickly, pulling data from multiple points, aligning them side by side. Then he saw it. A consistent shift. Milliseconds, small enough to ignore, but repeated. Aligned with specific entries, not enough to change answers, but enough to make something appear different than it was. Noah leaned back slightly, his mind racing. This wasn't cheating, he muttered under his breath. It was something else, something that altered perception. And that meant the story everyone believed was built on something unstable. Back in room 214, Malcolm stood by the window looking out over the school grounds. Students moved below, unaware of how close they were to the moment that would define everything. He wasn't thinking about himself. He wasn't thinking about the administration. He was thinking about Isaiah, a quiet student who had done everything right, and was now being asked to prove it in front of everyone. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. He didn't regret the decision, because this was the only way. Truth, when hidden, could be ignored. But truth, when exposed, could not be denied. The final bell rang, and with it the announcement came over the intercom. All students and faculty are to report to the main auditorium tomorrow morning for a scheduled academic review. No details, no names, but everyone knew. In the hallway, Brandon smiled. Across the building, Grace picked up her bag, her expression no longer uncertain. And in the computer lab, Noah saved the files he had been working on, his hands steady now. He didn't know exactly what he would do with the information yet, but he knew one thing. Tomorrow, the system would not be the only thing being tested. The truth on stage. The next morning, the sky over Chicago was brighter than the days before, but the cold still lingered in the air, sharp and quiet, as if the city itself was waiting. Inside Westbridge High, the auditorium filled faster than anyone expected. Students poured in from every hallway, teachers gathered along the sides, and the low hum of voices blended into something restless, something electric. It didn't feel like a school assembly. It felt like a trial. At the center of the stage stood a single table. On it, a stack of blank paper, a pen, and a sealed envelope containing the new exam. A camera had been set up on a tripod to record everything, its red light already blinking. Principal Harold Whitman sat in the front row, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Linda Carver held a clipboard, her fingers resting tightly along the edge. Charles Whitmore sat one seat away, legs crossed, his gaze fixed on the stage with quiet certainty. He wasn't watching. He was waiting. In the third row, Brandon Whitmore leaned back, arms folded, his confidence intact. Chase Miller sat beside him, his foot bouncing slightly while Tyler Hayes stared ahead, his face tense. At the far side of the auditorium, Grace Mitchell stood near the wall, her hands clasped together. She had chosen not to sit. She wanted to see everything clearly. Backstage, Malcolm Brooks stood beside Isaiah Reed. Malcolm's expression was calm, but his eyes were focused, steady. Isaiah looked smaller under the harsh stage lights, his slim frame outlined against the dark curtain. His hoodie sleeves were pulled slightly over his hands, a habit he had when he was thinking. But his face was still, not fearless, but controlled. Malcolm spoke quietly. "You don't have to prove anything to them." Isaiah nodded once. "I know." There was no hesitation in his voice, only clarity. Malcolm studied him for a moment, then placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. "Then show them how you think." Isaiah stepped forward. The curtain parted. The noise in the auditorium dropped. Not all at once, but in waves, as people noticed him walking onto the stage. A few whispers, a few low laughs, then silence. Isaiah didn't look at the crowd, not at Brandon, not at the teachers, not at the administrators who had already judged him. He walked to the table, sat down, opened the envelope, and began. The first few minutes felt slow, painfully slow. Students shifted in their seats, expecting hesitation, expecting uncertainty, expecting the moment where the illusion would break. But it didn't. Isaiah read each question carefully. Then he started writing. Not fast, not rushed, but deliberate. Each line connected to the next, each step built on the one before it. He didn't erase. He didn't pause. He didn't look up. In the third row, Brandon's expression changed slightly. At first it was amusement, then curiosity, then something else. Chase leaned closer. "He's just writing random stuff," he whispered. But Tyler didn't respond, because it wasn't random. On the stage, Isaiah had moved past the first problem, then the second. His handwriting remained consistent, controlled, almost methodical. It wasn't the work of someone guessing. It was the work of someone who understood. The whispers in the room faded, not because people chose to stop, but because there was nothing left to say. At the front, Principal Whitman leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. Linda Carver's grip on her clipboard tightened. Charles Whitmore's jaw shifted just enough to be noticed. Something was changing. Not loudly, but undeniably. Minutes passed. Isaiah continued. The camera recorded everything. No interruptions, no assistants, no excuses. In the corner of the auditorium, Noah Bennett stood near a small control console, his laptop open. His pale face was lit by the screen, his sharp gray eyes scanning the data one last time. He had waited. He had checked everything twice. Now he was certain. He took a breath, then stepped forward. At first, no one noticed him, but as he walked toward the stage, carrying his laptop, a few heads turned, then more. He reached the front, stopping just beside the stage. "Principal Whitman," he said, his voice clear but controlled. The room shifted again. Whitman looked at him, surprised. "Yes?" "I think there's something you need to see." Noah wasn't loud, but the silence made him impossible to ignore. Whitman hesitated, then nodded. Noah connected his laptop to the projector. The large screen behind the stage flickered. Lines of data appeared. Timestamps, submission logs, system records. Most of the students didn't understand what they were looking at, but the structure was clear enough. "This is the exam submission data from the midterm," Noah said. "I cross-checked it with the system response logs." Linda Carver stood. "What exactly are you implying?" Noah didn't look at her. "I'm not implying anything," he said. "I'm showing you." He pointed to a set of timestamps. These entries were delayed, not by seconds, by milliseconds. The room remained quiet. "That shouldn't happen," Noah continued. "Not like this, not consistently." He switched to another screen. The pattern became clearer. Aligned. Repeated. Someone, or something, caused the system to record submission times inaccurately. He said it didn't change answers, but it changed how the data looked. A murmur spread through the room. Noah took one more breath. There was no cheating. The words landed harder than anything that had come before. On stage, Isaiah finished the final line. He set the pen down. Didn't look up. Didn't react. Because he already knew. In the audience, Brandon's face had gone pale. Chase leaned back, confusion written across his face. Tyler stared at the screen, his hands clenched together. At the front, Charles Whitmore's expression had hardened, but the certainty in his posture was gone. Principal Whitman slowly stood. His eyes moved from the screen to Isaiah, to Malcolm, and for the first time, he didn't look in control. Grace Mitchell stepped forward from the side of the room. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. "I've observed Mr. Brooks' classes," she said. "His methods are challenging, yes, but they are fair. He does not give answers. He teaches students to find them." No one interrupted her, because now there was nothing left to interrupt. The narrative had already broken, and on the stage Isaiah Reed sat quietly, his completed exam in front of him, unquestioned, undeniable. The truth didn't need to be defended anymore. It had already spoken. The final light. The silence in the auditorium did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like something heavy being lifted, piece by piece, until people realized they were no longer holding their breath. Principal Harold Whitman remained standing at the front, his eyes still fixed on the screen behind Isaiah, where Noah Bennett's data had erased every doubt the room had been built on. For a moment he didn't speak. His hands rested against the back of the chair in front of him, fingers slightly tense, as if he were steadying himself against something unseen. Then he straightened. His voice, when it came, was measured, but no longer certain. "It appears," he said carefully, "that we have reached an incorrect conclusion." A murmur moved through the room. Not loud, but undeniable. Whitman continued slower this time. "The data presented confirms that there was no misconduct in the exam process." He paused. The next words cost him more than the first. "And therefore, the concerns raised regarding Mr. Brooks and Mr. Reed were unfounded." The sentence landed differently than the accusation had. Less force, but more weight. Across the room, students shifted in their seats. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared at the stage as if trying to reconcile what they had believed with what they had just seen. On stage, Isaiah Reed sat quietly, his completed exam untouched in front of him. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. But now, slowly he lifted his head, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. At the side of the auditorium, Malcolm Brooks stood still, his posture unchanged. He did not step forward. He did not demand recognition. His calm remained intact, but something in his eyes had softened. Not relief, something quieter. Closure. Charles Whitmore rose from his seat. For the first time, his confidence did not follow him. He adjusted his jacket, his movements precise but slightly delayed, as if his usual control had slipped just enough to be noticed. His gaze moved briefly toward Brandon, then away. He did not speak. He simply walked out. Brandon Whitmore remained seated. His shoulders, once relaxed, were now rigid. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his jaw tight, his usual expression gone. Chase Miller shifted beside him, unsure of where to look, while Tyler Hayes leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring ahead with a kind of quiet disbelief. No one laughed. No one whispered. Because there was nothing left to build a story from. The truth had already replaced it. Grace Mitchell stepped forward from the side of the auditorium, her movements steady now. The hesitation that once defined her was gone, not replaced by boldness, but by clarity. She didn't need to speak again. She had already chosen her side. Near the front, Noah Bennett stood with his laptop still open, the glow fading as the screen dimmed. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't looking for acknowledgement. But his shoulders were less tense, as if the weight of uncertainty had finally been set down. Assistant Principal Linda Carver closed her clipboard slowly. Her face remained composed, but the precision in her posture had softened. For someone who had always relied on control, this moment offered none. Whitman turned once more toward the audience. "We will be restoring Mr. Brooks to his position immediately," he said, "and all records regarding this matter will be corrected." A pause, then, more quietly, "We regret the error." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest he had ever come. The assembly ended without applause. Students rose slowly, conversations beginning again, but different now. Less certain, less confident, more aware. In the hallway, The energy shifted again, not into chaos, but into something unfamiliar. Reflection. Brandon walked alone. For the first time in years, no one followed him. Chase hesitated, then turned in another direction. Tyler lingered for a moment, watching Brandon go, then walked away as well. Brandon didn't call them back. He didn't look around. He just kept walking. That afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the school courtyard. The cold remained, but it felt different now, less sharp, less suffocating. In room 214, Malcolm stood by the window, watching the light stretch across the desks. The room was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet. This one wasn't built on tension. It was built on something else. Understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of it. A soft knock came at the door. Malcolm turned. Isaiah Reed stood there, his posture still reserved, his hands at his sides. "Yes?" Malcolm asked. Isaiah stepped in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Isaiah said quietly, "Thank you." Malcolm shook his head slightly. "You did the work." Isaiah nodded, but he didn't leave. Not immediately, because for once, he didn't feel the need to disappear. Later that day, as the last bell rang and students began to leave, another figure remained behind. Brandon Whitmore stood just inside the doorway. He didn't step in at first. He didn't speak. Malcolm noticed him but didn't say anything. After a few seconds, Brandon walked forward. Slower than usual, less certain. His hands were in his pockets, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from fear but from something unfamiliar. Awareness. He stopped a few feet from the desk. He began, then stopped. Malcolm waited. Brandon looked down. "I was wrong." The words were quiet, almost forced but real. Malcolm studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "What matters," he said, "is that you understand that." Brandon didn't look up, but he nodded, then he turned and left. No excuses, no explanations, just that. In the hallway, Grace Mitchell watched him go, her expression thoughtful. She understood what that moment meant, not redemption, but the beginning of responsibility. Across the building, Noah Bennett sat in the computer lab once more, this time with the system logs closed. A small email notification blinked on his screen. Recognition from administration. Acknowledgement of his findings. He read it once, then closed it, not because it didn't matter, but because it wasn't why he had done it. As the sun lowered outside, its light passed through the windows of room 214, casting a warm glow across the chalkboard. Malcolm picked up a piece of chalk. For a moment, he looked at the blank space in front of him. Then he wrote one word. Truth. He stepped back, not as someone who had won, but as someone who had stayed. Stayed long enough, calm enough, steady enough, for the truth to be seen. At the end of this story, nothing magical changed overnight. The system did not suddenly become perfect. People did not instantly become fair. What changed was something quieter. A truth that had been ignored was finally seen. A voice that had been overlooked was finally heard. In everyday life, we often do the same thing without realizing it. We judge too quickly. We assume too easily. We decide who someone is before we ever understand them. We see silence and call it weakness. We see difference and call it wrong. But this story reminds us of something important. Not everyone who stays quiet is powerless, and not everyone who is questioned is guilty. Sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who choose patience over anger, the ones who let the truth speak even when no one is listening. So the next time you see someone being judged, take a moment, look again, listen a little longer, because fairness does not happen by accident. It happens when people choose it. And if you have ever been misunderstood, if you have ever been judged without being heard, then you already know how much that choice matters. If this story meant something to you, take a second to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what you think about this story. And if you believe that truth always finds its way to the light, type Amen in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. May God bless you, protect you, and guide you in every step you take.